And while we wait for everyone to join, I just wanted to say a quick welcome to our webinar on Outlook and risk analysis of Ukrainian context in 2023. As you're joining, you will notice that there will be a poll organized by our communications department asking you how did you hear about the webinar, and that would be it would be great if you could share with us as those insights are valuable to our comms. As you know, the webinar is organized by the ACAPS Ukraine Analysis Hub. And ACAPS Ukraine Analysis Hub is providing independent analysis on the humanitarian impacts of the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine across the country and the region. If I can ask for the change of slide. We strive to produce products such as data sets, thematic reports, provide analytical support and capacity strengthening to both local and international responders in the Ukraine response and in the region. And today's webinar is going to focus on the anticipatory analysis report we published in January. And the report's title is Looking Ahead to 2023 Outlook and Risk Analysis. And we are not going to focus too much on just presenting what is in the report, as we more aim to facilitate a fruitful discussion on the most important risks surrounding the conflict, social economy and social cohesion and political risks in Ukraine. The report will be shared in the chat, and also the links will be provided. So we will very much welcome you to go and read the report and share any feedback that you might have. And and today we're going to have a fruitful discussion covering the most important subjects. What is going to happen today, if we can skip to the agenda? We are now in the opening remarks. Soon I will be introducing our panel, and we will have 3 sessions of thematic discussion on conflict-related risks, socioeconomic related risks, and social cohesion and political risks. We have also space for Q&A towards the end of the webinar, and we would be really grateful for any questions or discussion. You can challenge our analysis, that's always welcome. We know that the invitation said that the webinar is going to take an hour. We have prepared for that it can take a bit longer, probably an hour and a couple of minutes. We still think we are able to fit into a 1 hour time frame, but just so you know, we might also be a bit over time. Now I would like to introduce our panelists. So I hope that all the panelists were able to join us by now. And there is in Ukraine today, we have quite a difficult situation with power and internet. There have been a number of air raid alerts across the country, and I think there might be one ongoing just right now. So I know that the internet might be an issue, and we apologize in advance if something gets delayed because of that. But please welcome me in joining our panel. It's Varvara Pahomenko, who is a team leader at the crisis analysis team in Mercy Corps, Ukraine. Simon Schlegel, who is a senior analyst focusing on Ukraine at the International Crisis Group. Thomas Burns, who is a regional head of cash and markets at Norwegian Refugee Council Ukraine Response. And our facilitator for today, is Natalie Erlemont-Zorichak, who is head of program at ACAPS. I would also like to take a second to appreciate our senior analyst, Daniel Johnson, and Uliana Alnawaje, who was the lead analyst in the process of producing the risk report, and say just big thank you for them for creating such an interesting report, and they really deserve a lot of recognition. I will very quickly go and explain how our risk report looks like before we go into the discussion. As I've mentioned, in the interest of having an interesting discussion, we are not going to just present what we did, but we are going to have the panel on the most interesting subjects. But I still thought that it would be useful to encourage you to read the report. So our anticipatory analysis for 2023 consisted of 2 parts. Current context analysis and outlook and risk analysis. And the current context analysis and outlook section provides analysis of key recent developments and dynamics shaping the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. And we focused on targeted attacks on civilian infrastructure and socioeconomic impact of the conflict, which are the dynamics that are already driving humanitarian needs. And we wanted to provide outlook on how those dynamics might develop, even if no further risk or hazards are involved. The risk analysis part, however, outlines potential future events that could affect and further aggravate the humanitarian situation, the probability of these events occurring, and their potential humanitarian consequences. We have identified 7 risks surrounding capacity of the response, changes to social service payments, increased attacks and further conflict escalation, including unconventional weapons, nuclear safety and access to services and heating during winter. You could see all of the topics of the risks that are in the report, and we really encourage you to go through it and let us know what you think, whether you agree or not. And as for today, we just are going to cover the most important and urgent dynamics and risks and unpack them further with our distinguished panelists. So first, we're going to cover conflict-related risks, then socioeconomy, and then social cohesion and political risks. And right now, I hope we have all the panelists with us, and I am going to give the floor to Natalie to facilitate the first discussion. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Eva, and I hope all our panelists are with us now. I'm not sure I can see all of them, but anyway, I will give the floor soon. Yeah, so as Eva just mentioned, we're not going to come back specifically on each of the risks we raised in the report, but just try to, to take a step back and also to think about the future. That's the purpose of an anticipatory analysis, and to do some kind of joint analysis together. And to do that, we've decided to get the views of our panelists on a number of issues that seem to be really the most important related to the risk that were raised in the report. So we're starting with a first thematic discussion on the risk related to the conflict and the conflict dynamics. This is a very dynamic conflict, but there is, as we've mentioned in the report, it seems that there are a number of rumors related to a bigger offensive of Russia and some potential counteroffensive from on the Ukraine side. So that would be the first element we would like to discuss. I will first turn to Simon. I hope, Simon, you're there, to get your views on these global dynamics of the conflict and where it goes related to what you think. And then we will turn to Varvara in order to see what could be the humanitarian impact. So Simon, you've got the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. As I understood, my task in this section was to speak a little bit about capacity on both sides, and I will do that very superficially, and then hopefully get some feedback for that. So I will start with the Ukrainian side, where mobilization is continuing, and Ukraine said, or the Minister of Defense said at the beginning of the year, that they're not yet facing manpower bottlenecks, but that the mobilization continues in a quiet and continuous way. However, there have recently been a lot of rumors going around what concerns a ramped up mobilization. There's a lot of fear among Ukrainian men, and some of that has to do with changed rules in how companies can block their key employees from joining the army or from being mobilized, and also how state servants can leave the country. These rules have recently been adapted. And that has, among other factors, created this flurry of rumors going around. Just as an example, yesterday in Ternopil in Western Ukraine, the SBU conducted searches that they said have to do with a corruption scandal, but it created quite some anxiety among men there. Somebody I know said that he was not leaving the house because he was afraid to be handed a mobilization slip right on the street. Russia, on the other hand, seems to also have mitigated its worst manpower problem with this very risky mobilization that they have conducted in a messy way in the autumn. Now that seems to start to bear fruit, but it doesn't seem to have produced the 3-to-1 supremacy in manpower that is usually required for a powerful offensive, at least not in a very broad section of the very long front line. So manpower is still not a solved problem for Russia, and probably further waves of mobilization they will have to conduct much more quietly than the one last autumn. They will probably have to do it more clandestinely and probably more rely on people that are already somehow related to the army. The bottleneck for Ukraine in time is the time that it takes to as we've seen very impressively in January, to shift Western politics in terms of what type of military aid that they're getting. But of course, if we zoom out a little bit, it's never quick enough for the Ukrainians, and they're really the Western partners are always behind the curve. But if we look at it historically, then that is of course a lightning speed that the red lines in the West have been falling, and that we've moved from men carried anti-tank weapons last year to now tanks themselves, and there's a lot of talk about pilot training and possible delivery of modern Western airplanes. So the red lines there are falling really quickly, but it's not quick enough for the Ukrainians. They lose the people in the meantime. The bottleneck for Russia is to revamp its military-industrial complex to find replacement for the sanctioned components. And I want to be clear here. I think that the sanctions that the West has put on Russia, they work. They delay that revamping, but they cannot close all the loopholes. Russia will eventually find replacements. They will be costly. They will be it will cost time, but it's probably not a waterproof system. But Russia has less ammunition now than it had last year. They can no longer use these tactics of a wall of fire that they've used last summer in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, by indiscriminately using artillery on their enemy. They no longer have this capacity because they're running out of ammunition, but also because it's getting harder for them to bring ammunition to the front lines. And Ukraine has one distinct advantage there. Ukrainian artillerymen have 8 years more experience of shooting scarce ammunition. Ukrainian artillerymen have learned very well to use scarce ammunition more precisely than their Russian counterparts, because Russia always had ample ammunition until Ukraine started to bomb their ammunition dumps. And that's another, of course, important difference that we have compared to last year. Now, with the different, very much increased long-range artillery capacities on the Ukrainian side, Russia has much more problems to amass the amount of people, armament and ammunition close to the front line that they need for a forceful invasion. That is now dangerous for them, and they must learn to disperse that, and that costs time and makes their push less forceful. Russia also has to slow down on their missile attacks. Probably they will not have forever missiles, but there's different numbers being passed around. What is important here, I think, is always that they cannot go down to zero. They need to retain quite a large stock of long-range capacities for the case of a direct confrontation with NATO troops. So they're going to have to slow down and try to find new ways of replenishing their missiles. They have still ample stocks of S-300 surface-to-air missiles that they can also use as surface-to-surface, and increasingly do. These are devastating weapons. They cannot be taken out by Ukrainian air defense, but they have a 200-kilometer range, so they're especially feared in places like Kharkiv and Zaporizhia that are close enough to Russian-held territory to be targeted by these weapons. So that's my main points on capacity, and I will leave it at that in this section and see what this capacity could be used for. What do you think?
Thanks a lot, Simon, and thank you for this very comprehensive overview of the current dynamics in the conflict that all show some uncertainty from both sides. So I think now it would be really interesting to hear from a humanitarian operational point of view how this is seen from the field, and what this could lead to in terms of humanitarian needs. So Varvara, maybe could you share your views with us on that?
Thank you very much. And first of all, I want to congratulate ACAPS on releasing the new report, which is going to be very useful for all of us. Just following Simon's description, I want to say that we're still at the stage of uncertainty. A year later, we still speculate whether it's Russia going to offense, whether Ukraine is going to counter-offense. And I think this is a reality we, as a humanitarian organization, development organization, just have to now exist in and operate in. So basically, every time, keeping in mind that the front line can move either side. And what does it bring us to? I would say that we have three potential main scenarios of development, very roughly. So everything can stay as it is. We have sort of a stalemate, but the front line maybe moves a few kilometers one way or another, but mostly both sides have an equal military capacity and just continues this atrocious war, but within the same range where they are now. Another potential scenario, we see that Ukraine has another moment and regains the control over a big part of the territory, as we've seen what happened in Kharkiv already, in Kherson, and earlier last year in the spring in the north of Ukraine. Or, as you pointed it out, Natalie, there is a lot of discussion of Russia potentially gathering more strength and trying a new attack. Where this attack could be? And again, there is so much speculation that it could be again from the north, potentially Chernihiv, Sumy, Kyiv again. It could be a continuous attack in Donetsk Oblast, which is the epicenter of the conflict now. It could be an attack in the south, in the area of Zaporizhia, or maybe in several areas together. What I think we should acknowledge that we don't know neither plans or long-term strategies of both sides. And despite the fact there is a lot of reporting coming up from the ground, we're still sort of speculating with bits of information. I can only just maybe put on the plate what each of the scenario can mean for the humanitarian operation. And we've seen already all of them are being implemented at some point or for longer, shorter period. So if we talk about Ukrainian counteroffensive, what does it bring us? So first of all, there is new territories become accessible for humanitarian assistance. And I'm going to focus here now mostly on humanitarian assistance. I think at this stage of active hostilities, it's quite hard to talk about development or anything else, but we probably will touch this topic later. But it's the territories which are very first, they are accessible, but the access very often is very limited due to the mine pollution and contamination in those areas. Very much destroyed infrastructure, first of all, the transportation infrastructure. And in terms of the needs which we see there, they're quite similar. If we look at the territories which been regained by the control of which have been regained by Ukraine, the needs are quite similar. People need food, people need water, everything wash related. They need everything related to the housing, restoration of the destroyed housing, maybe not full restoration, but at least fixing windows, roofs, and everything related to heating and inventorization. And again, it's probably, even if the war stops now, everything linked to winterization is still going to be a priority even for the next winter. The level of damage already is so high, and especially damage to the energy infrastructure. What we also see is that the remote areas in those deoccupied territories are much more in need than the central cities or towns. As farther we go away from the bigger town, less assistance arrives there. And in general, rural communities are also more in need. And in this, we see that the pre-existing conditions play a role. In Ukraine in general, more rural, more agricultural areas, even prior to the Russian full-scale invasion, were poorer than the cities and industrial areas. And this pattern continue existing. And even more important note is that in those rural areas, people lost very often, in result of occupation and hostilities, lost livelihood. So they cannot plant their own gardens, they cannot feed their families, they cannot gather woods. And especially when we talk about areas which remain closer to the front line or to the border, it's very often a restricted access there, and continuous shelling, continuous attacks. Again, we see quite often the same type of vulnerable groups staying in those areas. It's very often elderly people, those who are left behind, people with disabilities, people large families. It's single mothers, but I would say that probably elderly people just make one of the biggest group of those who stay behind. So this sort of a massive deoccupation will bring us quite a similar and already known situation. And I would say that we still struggle as a broader community, humanitarian community, to respond to all those challenges, even at the territories which have been deoccupied for already quite some time ago, due to all those also security and access issues. If we see another Russian counteroffensive, so what would that mean? First of all, I would say that it's going to mean probably a lost access. So far, we see that the access at the Russian-controlled territories is extremely limited, if not impossible, for most humanitarian actors. We will probably face again the massive evacuation, so that civilians will run from those areas where Russian troops are advancing. Something which we've seen in the spring last year, and we continue seeing in some areas of continuous Russian advance in Donbass. And again, it's going to be a lot of destroyed infrastructure and houses, because we see so far that how the hostilities been going, if we take especially Donbass and Donetsk Oblast, that Ukrainian troops staying almost up until the last possible moment and continue fighting. So it means that the cities and it's highly densely populated area. So all the area where the hostilities are going, just turning into the wasteland and almost completely destroyed infrastructure and housing. So those civilians who's going to stay there will be in completely just dire conditions, as we see in Mariupol, as we see in Severodonetsk or in Bakhmut now. And in general, I think Donetsk Oblast, even talking for later, it's going to be has one of the highest needs because of all this destroyed infrastructure. And for the another last scenario, potential scenario, stalemate, that's pretty much what we have since November. And that's probably how it's going to continue look whether we face this scenario. So we have most of attacks in the front line and border communities. We're going to see the continuous missile attacks all across the country from Russia, targeting probably the continue targeting infrastructure, and as we see now, more of air defense as well. And we're going to see continuous economic decline in Ukraine, and degrading environmental situation. And not just in the Donbass, but as was mentioned, there is the risks of attacks on the nuclear power plant and everything linked to the water supply. So I would stop here, just putting all this on the plate. Thank you.
Thank you, Varvara. And I think obviously we have a number of, there are a number of risks that may create a number of additional humanitarian needs. That's again, that shows again that obviously the conflict dynamics has a direct impact on the conflict of the dynamics of the humanitarian response, of course. And that even if after 1 year of a conflict, we would be thinking a bit about some kind of long-term action, or even, as you mentioned, some more development action. But currently it seems really impossible, considering that the conflict is still very fluid, very dynamic, and that the new areas that are finally open to humanitarian access create new emergency necessities. So thank you for this. Thank you for this perspective. I think we will come back on a number of different elements, notably the situation of the most vulnerable groups and the economic situation. That's a very good transition with our second thematic area. And I will ask Tom here to make this transition, because we've been talking and we've raised in the report a number of impacts related to the war economy and the impact on the economy of the country, and the capacity for people to access to livelihood, also the impact of the conflict on the markets and how it can impact afterwards also the people. So Tom, can you give your views on that, where we're going in this area, and what could be the additional needs or the additional impacts on the livelihood economy for people in Ukraine?
Hello, yes, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk, and to the ACAP teams for this great report that you've gotten out. Obviously a large topic, and I'll try and keep it as constrained as possible, but, you know, first of all, economic risk. We are talking about this context where we have reports of the World Bank, has decreased by 30%. We have a substantial decrease in exports and national tax income. We have devaluation of the hryvnia with corresponding increases in inflation and prices. And all of this, in any situation, these are deflationary, recessionary risks in an economy. You know, there's a lot of impacts that, you know, that are having here that are impacting not just people directly conflict affected, not just IDPs, but all the wider economy. And, you know, that is driving dimensions here. Additionally, we have dramatic, catastrophic, or not catastrophic, but dramatic labor market disruption. Some of them dramatically increasing labor market supply. We have a large number of IDPs who have moved from one part of the country to, you know, who have been displaced. Some of them coming from industrial centers in the east of the country, now living in more service-orientated areas of the west, which have a very different economic model. But we also have conscription, which has removed large numbers of young people from the labor market. And we also have the large-scale refugee crisis, which means that, again, a substantial proportion of, as we know, young women who have left the country as well.
I think we've lost Tom. Tom, can you still hear us? Okay, we're gonna, I guess he will be able to connect again. So maybe with this very short introduction from Tom, Maybe Varvara, you would like to comment a bit more on those very specific additional needs created through the economic impact of the conflict, and especially maybe on the most vulnerable people, including IDPs and people on the moon. Varvara? And when Tom comes back, we will give him the floor back.
Yes.
Yes, I apologize. The error that started here and it for some reason cut me out instantly. So I've just come back on my 3G. So sorry about that.
Okay, so I think Tom, we lost you.
Everyone?
Yeah, we lost you just when you were explaining a number of difficulties, especially for people to access the labor market, for the refugee crisis, and then you cut.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm in Kyiv, and we just had an error alert here that somehow cut off my internet. So I apologize for that. So yeah, I'll just quickly finish off there. So yes, there is a lot of disruption to the labor market. We also, as Valeria was mentioned, a colleague from Mercy Corps, that there is substantial disruption both in the front line, recently deoccupied, and obviously
Okay, so I don't know if you can still hear us, but we've lost you again. So I will jump to Varvara this time. So considering those global impacts on the local economy and more globally on the economy in the country, Varvara, what do you think would be the main focus we should have related to the humanitarian response, and what will be the main focus in the coming months?
Despite the fact that I mentioned that humanitarian emergency assistance probably going to remain a priority for the coming year, I still think that we as a broader humanitarian community, aid community, needs to focus on some other forms of assistance. And that's what we keep hearing from people all the time, that they don't need just food or just wash kids. They want some help to restart their life, to restart their businesses. And Ukraine sort of exists in also all Ukraine suffers from attacks, and today's attack just demonstrated it once again. But we have quite a different still situation in the areas closer to the front line and those which are a bit farther away, and where it's a little safer, I would say. There is no at least daily shelling. And there we still see that the business continues operating. Many reopened, maybe not at full scale, but they try to continue generate some income. And we very often hear this from the local communities, from the local authorities, businesses, that they would like to get some support on this. And especially for local communities and local authorities, it's quite important because their entire income for the local budgets depends on the taxes from businesses. Those taxes later on goes to pay for schools, for some local infrastructure. So it just keeps the community alive. And it goes for both rural and urban areas. Agriculture plays a huge role in Ukrainian economy. We did a research in agriculture at Mercy Corps last year, and that was just in unison. All the small businesses and even family level productions were saying that we just want to continue working. That's all we want. And some of them need support, very simple support, with just some small money to restore destroyed infrastructure or destroyed mechanical, some mechanisms they use, or like buy a new tractor. Others face much more greater challenge, and it's a challenge for the entire, I think, economy, is to reorient itself on reorient and export as much as possible, as the purchasing power inside Ukraine decreased quite significantly. So a lot of what used to be produced for the local market can't be sold there anymore. So they have to think where to go. And it means now start treating their production in a completely different way, do more of processing, storing, getting access to the European markets, getting access to the other markets. And I think that's something which is possible to do. Maybe, again, not all across Ukraine. There are areas which are very dangerous. And sometimes you talk to the agricultural producers and they said, yeah, we have to stop operation. 6 out of 12 of my staff been killed. So I just cannot continue working and everything is mined. But some areas where it's possible, another big challenge, and what Thomas mentioned, is industrial areas, as most of them are especially located in the east. And it's the big cities of Kharkiv, Dnipro, Zaporizhia, Mariupol, which used to depend on giant factories or coal mines, where you would have thousands of people or even dozens of thousands of people working together. And a lot of them stopped their operation or just decreased it to the minimum possible capacity. And the perspectives of restarting or reopening are very grim, even if the hostilities stop right now. The level of destruction already is so huge, so that we're gonna face a lot of people, and especially a lot of men, middle-aged men, being unemployed in those big cities. So what's they gonna do? Considering that the man cannot leave the country, cannot go to work somewhere in Poland or other neighboring countries. And to think about this, to think about how Ukrainian entire labor market will change, how it can adapt to the new realities. That's, I think, it's a big challenge for all of us. Clearly for Ukrainian government, but for those organizations which try to help and assist Ukrainians and get back on track with their work. So if we can start already thinking or maybe doing something small towards that direction, I think it's very important, because again, it shows that a year later, war is still going on. We cannot forever just provide food to millions and millions of people.
Thanks a lot, Barbara. And I know that, Tom, you're back. Would you like to comment maybe the last part of notably the question about how will markets adapt to this new situation, and what can we foresee related to that? Because as Barbara mentioned, we're still in a trend where we provide, well, the humanitarian community provides humanitarian assistance, but then the question is how the country will cope finally itself with the situation, and how could the markets adapt to the current situation. Do you want to comment a bit more on that before we move to another topic? Simon?
Yes. Yeah, I want to support what Varvara has said. I mean, it's really, I think Ukraine faces deep demographic changes and will probably shrink a lot, both in population and in economy. We hope not in territory, of course, but it is a realistic perspective that Ukraine will shrink a lot. Now it's 8 million people who have left the country, and as we know, they are mostly women and children due to the male travel ban. 2/3 of those do not currently have a clear plan of going back. I mean, this may change, but this is a huge number of people lacking. It then will be very decisive whether European countries will allow, for example, men to join their families in the European Union, or whether families, if they want to reunite, they have to come back. But if they come back, they will probably go where the male members of the family live, and that will be where there are jobs available. And that is a huge problem in the East. There's in the war devastated areas, there is a lot to do, but there are very few jobs there. And it's a catch-22. If there's a lot of people going back, the state would invest in reconstruction, but only if people come back and demand that from the state. But if that is not happening, the state is not investing, and if the state is not investing, people do not go back. So it's really a catch-22 there. And that, of course, leads to exactly the situation that the most vulnerable elderly people, chronically ill, people with disabilities, and single parents remain there. They have lost their social support network of family and neighbors, and will increasingly depend on social benefits from the state, which the state cannot pay for reasons that we've heard, because it raises its taxes locally. Since the decentralization reform, these tax revenues are not there, and therefore there's a big danger that they will permanently become dependent on humanitarian aid. The Donbas industrial area is full of mono towns, towns purpose-built for the production of one product. The most extreme example is maybe Severodonetsk, which was purposely built in the 1930s to produce fertilizer. That factory has already been defunct, or not defunct, but much reduced before the invasion. But now that infrastructure is destroyed, and that's the case for many other towns as well. And if a city is destroyed and has lost its reason of being, then it's really very hard for me to imagine how to revive it. I think it will need all the experts from Detroit and Northern England and the rural area in Germany combined to think of how to revive these areas and how to bring people back there. They need decades of investment from foreign countries to revive these areas, I think. And in many cases, it will probably be the government may come to the conclusion that it's not advisable to revive those areas. And the same is a little bit true with agriculture. The thing there is that that most people who rely on agriculture do not own the land that they rent out, the land that they've the companies do not own the land. The people own the land, but it's too little to buy the tractors and the combine harvesters that these very mechanized type of agriculture requires, and therefore they rent the land to big companies, and these companies will have little incentive to push for the revival of land that isn't theirs. So the land is now mined and littered with explosives. Probably these big companies that own all the combine harvesters and the tractors, they will move on to other areas where they can keep working.
Thanks a lot, Simon. Oh, I think you've been cut. I will take this. I will take the advantage to give maybe again the floor to Tom. Maybe Tom, you would like to comment a bit on those last elements related to the global evolution of economy and difficulties in Ukraine.
Indeed, and I apologize. The 3G here in Kyiv is ping in and out, so it's just kicking in and out. So if I drop over. So first of all, I would actually say, disagree with my colleague from Mercy Corps. We need to be talking about recovery and livelihoods now, not going forward. It isn't a moment for later on. And the reason I say that is 58% of all IDPs can be displaced for more than 60 months. So we're talking about, yes, we have a continuously rapid onset emergency situation and a protracted displacement.
So I think it's really difficult for Tom to join us. He was just mentioning the protracted situation of displacement, which is a subject we did not completely touch, but I suggest that we discuss around that with our third thematic area of discussion, because of course this conflict dynamic and the economic impacts of the conflict have an impact on the social cohesion, and this issue of the political stability also raise question around social cohesion and how things will go, both in Ukraine and in Russia, by the way. So this is also something that was raised in our report, that we are in a kind of step-by-step protracted situation, even if the conflict is really very dynamic, and they are, as we saw just a minute ago, there are new needs that happen each time. There are new areas that can be open to access. Still, there are more and more questions about how the communities can cope with the situation, and how the conflict situation, but also the economic situation may affect social cohesion within Ukraine, but also potentially within Russia. And so that's our third topic. And I suggest that our panelists could also tackle the issue of the protracted displacements and the dynamics that creates with the host communities and how this will evolve in the coming month. Maybe Simon, I don't know if you're back. Maybe you could start with giving your views, your global views on how the social cohesion and political stability may evolve and how this can affect the conflict's developments and also the humanitarian situation.
Can I just, Simon, before you go on, I wanted to say a few words from Thomas, because he just sent me his talking points, apologizing profusely for not being able to deliver them himself. But I think a very nice introduction to this third thematic area on social cohesion is that according to Thomas, and I'm going to be a messenger here, the main challenge is that we have 10 million people identified as being in need of support by the government Dopomaga social registry system, and it would cost $2 billion to cover them with cash assistance. And it is simply not realistic for either humanitarian cash to be able to cover those needs in a sustainable manner. And we also know that there is a big budget gap for 2023, with government also not having resources to cover those systems, which can very easily lead to much more severe needs, and also social cohesion issues considering protracted displacement, but also on the political sphere when the budget might not, there might be issues between whether the spending should go into defense or social protection. And I will just close it here from Thomas. Thank you so much, Thomas, if you can still hear us, and sorry for the internet. And Simon, over to you.
Shall I go on?
Yeah. Go on, Simon.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Can we hear now with the? Okay. Yeah, I think I would just take it off where we've ended. I think that the obvious conflict that we will have to pay attention to is the conflict between internally displaced people and the community is already there. Everything is scarce, most of all housing, of course, but also schooling and access to medicine and other services. All of that is scarce, and that has already led and will lead to further conflicts if not mitigated. And unfortunately, of course, people have different linguistic and cultural backgrounds, and those are sometimes instrumentalized, and that is a tendency that's really something that I think we should hold against. Most famously, probably the mayor of Ivano-Frankivsk in Western Ukraine has said already early on that he expects of his citizens a gentle Ukrainification, that people would not speak Russian to Russian speakers. And I've heard stories when people were given a place to live under the condition that they would speak exclusively Ukrainian there. These are stories that are maybe outliers, but they do illustrate that these conflicts that are really about resources can be sort of translated into a cultural or linguistic conflicts. Also, what is scarce is for it's sometimes not obvious, but one person in Western Ukraine told me that parking space is really scarce in Western Ukrainian cities because they have this medieval layouts, and people from Western Ukraine, from Eastern Ukraine, are used to park their cars on the sidewalks as they do on the broad Soviet sidewalks, and that just doesn't work. And so there have been, scratches on cars with Eastern number plates and things like that. So it's all there in the mix, and I think we have to be really careful that that doesn't translates into this broader conflict. But there, of course, are also very good examples where people have overcome these differences, and of course, the overall story is one of solidarity and support, and I think it's very important to keep that going, even if the volunteers are slowly burning out and coming to the end of their resources. It's really important to support them and to see where volunteer helpers can become paid workers and be given the tools that they need to save themselves from burning out. And I think it's really important that the humanitarian assistance is administered based on need and not on category. IDP is, or internally displaced person, is an administrative category in Ukraine, and it's important that it is. But there are, because of the raised cost of living, there are also lots of local people who have been driven closer towards poverty. So it's important that not the administrative category of IDP or veteran or pensioner is being taken as the basis of humanitarian aid, but the assessment of need. Another type that I think is another type of conflict that might occur is between veterans who've suffered from the war and people who have not served in the war and have profited from veterans' protection, but kept on their fairly comfortable lives. I think that is a conflict already out there. Then also between soldiers who have served at the front and at the rear, if it's about scarce resources to the front lines, there is already this conflict. It's never enough clothing and food and technology, and these volunteers, for example, that supply to front lines, they sometimes have to make a decision whom to send it to, and they often get requests from areas that are not really under fire right now, and they then have to sort of also make a decision where scarce resources go. But within the armed forces, there is also the border guards are also fighting the war, and the National Guard also, and they not always have the right, the same rights for benefits afterwards. They are not all as well integrated in veteran care as the army is, and that's another area I think that where the Ministry for Veteran Affairs is really eager to integrate these veterans as well in their care system that will, it's going to be decades of care that is needed, medical care and psychosocial assistance. Then in liberated territories, the likelihood of conflict between those who are seen as collaborators and been accused by their neighbors of having collaborated, that is certainly a huge conflict potential. There is quite some social demand, I think, for justice, to bring people to justice that might have collaborated with the occupying forces. It's been a long political process to adopt a law on collaboration since 2014. There have been 4 different attempts in the parliament. Never one has gone through because concerns to adopt a law that would allow blanket accusations were always too great. But then just 10 days after the invasion, a law sailed through parliament really very quickly, and it's full of loopholes and vague and overlapping with other laws, and it allows for a lot of inconsistent judgment potentially. It needs to be decided what types of resources. For example, the law says only that if you provide occupying forces with resources, that doesn't specify what type of resources. It says they use the word support without specifying it. So there's a lot of interpretation there and no legal practice so far. And also Ukrainian court systems process about 20,000 criminal cases a year. But these new laws have already produced accusations of nearly as many cases in just 1 year of conflict. So it's also just a huge problem that the Ukrainian courts will not have the capacity to process all of these, and that many people will be in limbo for a long time. Because it's not only collaboration cases that would have to go through the court system, it's also requests for compensation payments for damaged property and so on. Also fights about property. In many of these areas, people have got one house destroyed and moved into their neighbor's house, and now the neighbor is coming back, and there's there's a conflict going on, especially if property documents and identity documents have been lost or destroyed. I've heard a story from a woman who went back to Starobilsk in Donetsk Oblast, where one of her houses has been destroyed and the other has been inhabited by a stranger, a woman who's packed all her belongings into vacuum packs to save space and then to sell it out. She went to the police and the police came to this house, but this woman that inhabited her house was entirely unconcerned because she said, you first have to prove that this is your stuff and you don't have the documents to do that. So this woman just knew that law enforcement in these areas is quite strained right now and that there's not much capacity to deal with cases like this.
Thank you to mention this point, because I think that's something that may have a real impact on social cohesion in the aftermath of a conflict. Notably, examples in other countries show that these house and land properties issues are really, really important, especially when people lost nearly everything. And that usually the international community and the affected countries are not well prepared to tackle that. And that creates additional issues in the aftermath of a conflict. So thank you to mention this point. There are also a number of rumors related to political instability and issues within Russia. What would you say about that? Because there are rumors and sometimes too big. So could you give us your views on that?
Yeah, I think it's possible that Russia is going to destabilize. Just to keep in mind that no political experts predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union, so we need to be careful, of course. We shouldn't speculate, but we should take the science seriously. I don't think that we should base any planning on a scenario of a collapse. And I'm also not sure that we should hang our hopes too high for what might happen if Russia collapses. It might actually turn out that the world is a safer place with Russia as one piece. So yeah, I think it's not a good avenue to base planning on to speculate on Russian reintegration, disintegration.
Okay, thanks a lot. And thank you for this again very global overview on what could be the risk on social cohesion in Ukraine. Maybe I can turn now to Varvara. In order also to follow up on what we've just mentioned before related to the fact that there were a number of more vulnerable people or groups that may be at risk in this environment of where social cohesion may also be at risk. How does this may impact on humanitarian action and humanitarian response? Maybe Varvara, you can illustrate that, considering that we also had a question in the chat related to the fact that, okay, we have some vulnerable groups. How do we balance the response between the necessity to respond to the needs of those groups and the fact that a country needs also to rely on younger people in order to recover and in order to go back to some kind of development? So how do you think this will be taken into account in humanitarian dynamics? I know this is finally two questions in only one, but if you can also try and make a bridge towards this question that was asked in the chat. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. If you don't mind, I'll start maybe with IDPs and prolonged displacement. And actually with an example, not from Ukraine, but from neighboring Moldova. I think that's a country which quite often overlooked and forgotten. We did our research there just recently on how Ukrainian refugees stay there, how the local communities react on this. And I think it's a good example where, on the one hand, local civil society, local communities were very open and helped a lot. So basically almost over 500,000 Ukrainians at some point went through Moldova, a country which probably has about, in reality, 2 million people living there. So it's now still host a lot of Ukrainian refugees. But I think that when we talk about especially protracted displacement, it's very important to keep in mind what are the local communities, what are their needs. And what we could see there, that it's more and more a discussion that, well, yes, Ukrainian refugees, of course, need assistance, but the economic level and the level of development in Moldova is also so low that providing assistance just to the Ukrainian refugees create really tensions in the communities, because local people need all of this not less than others. So if you provide, I don't know, a hygiene kit to the refugees and don't provide anything to the family which hosts them, which live in an equally difficult condition, it creates a tension. So I think it's always about balancing and understanding who are more in need. And as Simon mentioned, that it's not necessarily that IDPs are always most in need. Very often we can see that people who stayed behind and didn't leave the area are probably much more in need and much more vulnerable than those who fled. Very often those who managed to leave, they had at least some resources to live. And those who stayed behind have nothing. Another what I wanted to touch, yes, it's communities in those areas either which were under occupation or close to the front line. And especially in the areas which used to be under occupation, we see deeply traumatized people. Entire communities are deeply traumatized because they had to go through the fears of war, being killed, executed. They had to go through the making moral decisions whether to collaborate or not. And some of them become victims of human rights or IHL violations. And in many of those communities, we hear from people that they actually acknowledge they need psychosocial support, something which is quite rare you can hear in places like Ukraine. And it brings us to psychosocial and also legal support. It's another thing which often comes up because, as for example, Simon mentioned, all those issues related to property or criminal prosecution on one side or another for the actions which have been done during the hostilities. And we can see that as longer the area stays under occupation, the harder it is. And the harder it is going to be to reintegrate it later, with more sort of a splits and cuts inside society, we will see, where people would have more questions to each other, to the government, to everyone. And specifically, I think we need to talk about and think it's about the marginalized groups, which used to be marginalized even before the invasion. And in many areas which directly affected by the conflict, we have a huge number of people, for example, with serious diseases, which are seen as marginalized. It's tuberculosis, HIV. For example, Donetsk Oblast was leading on both of those in the country, and how those groups, which already were seen as just outcasts in society, now can get an access to assistance. Then it's a people, obviously a Roma community, which traditionally has a lot of problems in getting access to state services and now to assistance. Simon mentioned also challenges Russian-speaking people face when they relocate to Ukrainian-speaking areas, but I also think it's worth mentioning the Russian citizens and Belarus citizens living in Ukraine. So prior to the invasion, there was about 120,000 Russian citizens living with a permanent or temporary residency permit in the country. It's very often it's family members, it's mixed families, and as closer we go to the border areas like Kharkiv, like Sumy, where you would have from Kharkiv to neighboring Belgrade, it used to be 40 kilometers to go, 50. More of those cases you would see of mixed families especially. So, and those people what sort of access to assistance they have, and how they can face some sort of discrimination even sometimes, especially when they travel across the country, especially if it's a man. So it's something to keep in mind as well. Another issue, last one I wanted to touch, is the returnees. The areas which return in the areas which return under Ukrainian control, people who left and then returning, how they being perceived, how they being accepted by those who stayed all the time there. It's something else which comes up now more and more. What I mentioned before, another sort of a split, not split, but growing conflict we see is a conflict between local communities, local authorities, and national authorities. And Ukraine went through the decentralization reform in recent years, when the local communities and local authorities got quite a lot of power. And as I mentioned before, a lot of local funding, they could keep a lot of taxes. And now with an appointment of civil military administration directly from Kyiv, with decreased taxes, we can see how more and more conflict appears even in public already about this, about distribution of power, about who is in control, who is supposed to make decision. And that's something which affects the life of the local population and potentially the work of humanitarian organizations in the area. Just one word to say about Russia. I think one thing we need to keep in mind talking about the dynamics in Russia, that the access to Russia is extremely limited on doing research. To understand what's going on the ground, it's another big challenge. Yep, thank you.
Thanks a lot, and thank you for this. Sorry, go on.
And I didn't touch the question from the chat. Yes, that's indeed it's a big issue. So when we talk about the communities probably most destroyed, we're going to have what kind of population stays there? Elderly people, people with disabilities, who are not very likely to be able even to restore their own buildings, even if they provided the construction materials or anything else. And then you have big cities with younger people, but unemployed. I think it's a challenge, but it's a challenge which is possible to address, how to bring them together. There is so many people in need, not just for reconstruction, but for instance, to take care of those single elderly people, people with disabilities, as who used to take care of them, as their relatives, or for example, government social workers who used to be women. Many of them fled and left for the other countries of the west of Ukraine. So they can't already take care and come and check just once a week whether a person is alive, whether he has a medicine or everything. Would it be possible to link those unemployed people from the neighboring cities and those communities in need? Probably. We see already some initiatives, some volunteer initiatives working on this. We see some government initiatives trying to address those issues. And probably this is a way to go, yes, to rethink completely how the social services are organized, how the reconstruction and job market is organized. And we're going to see a lot of people probably moving around and being on the move in general.
Thanks a lot. And I think, thank you for giving all those elements that show that definitely especially when in a protracted conflict like this one, that is still very dynamic, we are still confronted to very, I would say, basic humanitarian needs that push every actors to remain in a kind of emergency mode. And at the same time, there are other kind of effects that require other types of actions in order not to create immediately some kind of basis for risk on social cohesion. And that's usually the case in a number of conflicts that become protracted, but where usually there's no real time at the moment of the conflict to tackle issues related to justice, and also issues related to suspicion and to how you treat people that had to make some difficult choices. And those are the basis usually of a very difficult issues related to social cohesion. And this also reflects another comment we had in the chat that was connected to one of the elements you developed related to the fact that a number of people have been marginalized because either the returnees, they are not really well accepted, or people that had to live in occupied areas when the areas are deoccupied, they are suspected of being collaborators with the occupants, and that creates some kind of trauma that is also not good for social cohesion. This made me also think about another subject that is connected with the first question in the chat, and maybe we can also open the floor to everybody. Do not hesitate to put your questions in the chat or to ask in order to ask for the flow. We did not really talk about education and the education services. It is connected also with one of the questions in the chat. What are we going to do with young people? How do we want to maintain a kind of basis for the next step and the reconstruction? Do you have some views to share on that? Maybe Varvara or Simon? Varvara, do you want to go first?
Well, on education, I think two points. First of all, it's 3 years already as the kids in Ukraine don't study in a normal way. First 2 years of COVID, and then it's a year of war. We're seeing that in some areas which used to be under occupation or frontline communities, like in Mykolaiv or in Kherson, kids weren't going to school at all for almost 8 months, 9 months. If it's a younger kids, it may be a bit easier for them to catch up later. But if it's already kids at the teenagers at the age of 14, 15, it will be very hard. So we will see the long-term effect of this. Another big challenge is destroyed infrastructure, educational infrastructure. Schools are very often one of the first buildings to get destroyed. Very often it's the biggest building in the village, which been occupied by militaries because of this, because they stay empty, so they're being used, as a result being targeted. So even if the place remains, returns to, let's say, normal, there is no hostilities, it will take years now to restore all the infrastructure. Then it's another challenge. It's those children who were attending schools at the areas, occupied areas. And as I mentioned, as longer it goes, it's harder it is to handle later on. If we take, for example, the areas which were under control of pro-Russian separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, where it's already, 8, almost 9 years, kids being educated under completely different programs with a different worldview, let's say, to imagine how, if these territories return under Ukrainian control, how reintegration would go on. It's a challenge for generation. And there is another big problem. It's the kids of refugees in those who found refuge in other countries. So we see that some parents have to make a difficult choice, but to keep kids attending schools online, that they would be able to return and integrate into the Ukrainian system later on, or they would have to start going to schools in Moldova, in Ukraine, in Poland, in Germany, switching to the different language. So once your kid probably goes to school in German for a year or two, returning back to Ukraine will be much, much harder for the entire family. So it's another big, as I said, a choice for the families to make. And we will see, probably can assess the whole impact on education only later.
Thank you. Maybe I can again ask if anybody has a question, just put it in the chat or just raise your hands in order you can ask your question to our panelists. I didn't see any other questions in the chat, so and I don't see any hand raised. So maybe I can go back to Simon now. If you want to comment on the last issues we raised, do not hesitate, and then I will give back the floor to Eva.
Yes, two or three points on education, maybe. So, as Barbara said, it's schools really determine where the parents with children can return to. If there's no school, then they cannot return there. Now, even the situation in newly liberated areas is that there is sometimes no internet. So people would agree to have their kids internet school or online school for another couple of months, but not even that is reliably available. And I think that the now almost 3 years of online schooling experience can, of course, be used as a stopgap solution until schools are fully functioning back. So that might be a bonus that could be used. And then another point on education is that teachers have a special place in these collaboration laws. One sub point of this law is especially minted towards teachers who have taken a role in the school system of the occupying forces. That is really a very painful point, I think, because a lot of teachers will have gotten into a form of contact with the occupying forces that makes it unacceptable for Ukrainian authorities to have them teach Ukrainian kids. And there's a professional ban as one of the sanctions of this law that you can ban people from working in schools for 10 or 15 years. And that also will just add to an already lacking workforce in schools, especially in these areas. So it's really a catch-22 again. And do you punish these people and lose teachers? And then how do you get other teachers there? Or do you accept that somebody might have changed what they've said about Lenin and Pushkin to the school children and let them go back? And do they have to go through re-education for that or not? And then a very important point also being said, what do you do to people with diplomas from non-government controlled areas? And that is really, I think, something where Ukraine could learn a bit from its neighboring Moldova, that has found a modus vivendi with its Transnistrian breakaway republic, that there is a mechanism that people can, through extra exams or through a relatively short procedure, gain access to universities with school diplomas from Transnistria. And I think an adopted version of that could maybe solve this problem, but it's still in the future, because these areas still need to be liberated.
Thanks a lot, Simon, and thank you to our three panelists. I'm now going to give the floor back to Eva. I thank you for the global overview of the situation you gave related to the still very uncertain situation that creates huge current effects, but that also show that there are foreseen additional issues and challenges that will need attention sooner than later. I'm not sure it was a very bright picture of the situation, but thank you for sharing your views and perspectives. Eva, I give you the floor back.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I just wanted to say thank you as well to Simon, to Varvara, and to Thomas. Thank you for your expertise and for taking the analysis that we've done and putting it more in the perspective of more political or economic views. That was fascinating to hear from my perspective. It raised many questions to unpack in further analysis, and it really showed me that these discussions around marginalized groups and vulnerable communities, we still understand very little about how the aid actually could be targeted in Ukraine, and this is something we will definitely be following up with our analysis. Thank you so much, Natalie, for moderating and facilitating this discussion in such an effective way, even being very reactive to internet failures and always bringing the discussion together. We welcome you to give us feedback. There will be a short survey once you leave the the webinar, and we will be really grateful if you could fill that in. There is a QR code that you can use to register to our newsletter and to ensure that you can receive our products. Please send us feedback, get in touch with ukraine.hub@acaps.org. Thank you so much for your active participation, and we are going to keep you updated about any further sessions, and we are always really happy to hear from you. Thank you, Varvara, Simon, Thomas, Natalie, for this panel, and we will talk to you all soon again.
Thank you very much.